Here we are in Community Matters, and we have a special super show with Susannah Drake. She's a visiting architect from DLANDstudio in Brooklyn, New York, my favorite place.
Believe it or not, right?
You know, there's a lot of creativity in Brooklyn.
It's true.
And you're here to talk about architecture and landscape architecture, yeah.
Right. I was brought in by the University of Hawaii to give a lecture about my work. And my work really focuses on large-scale infrastructure systems, like green infrastructure and climate resilience. So very applicable to Hawaii.
Oh yeah, we want to talk about that, you know. And Sharon Moriwaki, my co-host, in many ways.
Well, and this was music to my ears because we just came out of our energy legislative briefing on climate change and climate mitigation, and also Kaka'ako is near to and dear to us because of the last open shoreline that, you know, we have high sea level and we want to see how we can mitigate that effect. So we really were pleased to have you on.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, just get the ground rules straight. Let me just check something out here. Alexa, what is architecture?
Architecture has a few uses. As a noun, 1, an architectural product or work.
Have you seen
2, the discipline dealing with the principles of design and construction and ornamentation of fine buildings. 3,
Fine.
the profession of designing buildings and environments with consideration for their aesthetic effect. 4, computer science, the structure and organization of a computer's hardware or system software.
That's enough. How much of that do you agree with, Susannah?
Well, I think the term architecture has expanded, and I think a lot of architects are actually taking on issues of urban design and urban planning and city making, and also making of landscapes. And I am both an architect and a landscape architect. I don't know what Alexa would say about landscape architecture, but I'd be curious.
Oh, you said Alexa.
I said
as
her
soon as you say
name.
Alexa, you
Goodness.
invoked. Alexa, what is landscape architecture?
The term landscape architecture means the art, planning, design, management, preservation and rehabilitation of the land in the design of large man-made constructs.
No, that was
Wow, that's really
What a resource, eh?
buzzkill. What we do is so much more meaningful than that. I think.
Well, why don't you tell us what it is today? Because, you know, I think a lot of us are living in another time. We don't fully
Right.
understand all the evolution of this field of architecture and landscape architecture, and how important it is in, you know, in the planning and execution of a modern city.
Well, when you think about some of the great landscapes in urban settings, you know, parks like Central Park come to mind, or you think of some of the great waterfronts, right, across the United States. And really, you know, the inclusion of open space in cities is sort of fundamental to the way they work. And I think there's been a greater recognition of that in recent years, although even in New York with the landscapes of Robert Moses that are sort of notoriously about cars, he also created a lot of parks and playgrounds and parkways that actually did add a lot of green space to the city. So I'm actually working on a lot of those kinds of landscapes, those infrastructure projects that, you know, maybe had a thread of green within them in the early sort of imagination, and that green may not have ultimately reached fruition in the construction. So
It's not about value engineering, it's about human value engineering.
it is, and I think it's about providing really public amenity to people and to communities that really need the resources. So I try to really help underserved communities that have been kind of put upon by these infrastructure systems that are running through cities.
Tell us about your firm. Tell us about your staff. Tell us about your clientele.
Well, I do a lot of public work. I do some private work. But I would say the work that I'm most known for really has to do with, again, thinking about infrastructure, thinking about how we have these linear rights of way that run through our cities, like the train lines and the highway lines, and these spaces that weren't necessarily intended to be about sort of urban occupation. They're really intended to move cars, move people. So what I'm doing is going in and saying, okay, urban space is too expensive and too valuable to have it only devoted to a transportation use. So we should really be thinking about the value of that space and how we can improve it by really layering on additional programs. And whether that is by, putting a cap over a highway trench to build new park space, recreation space for an underserved community, or building underneath an elevated rail line, for instance, to enable sort of new public functions or new light industrial functions.
Park Avenue
Park
is
Avenue.
is over the trains.
Exactly.
What a great idea that was. It could have been trains right out there in public.
It really is a great idea, and was a great idea, and facilitated a phenomenal amount of real estate development. That's some of the most valuable real estate in New York City.
Yeah. New York, it really is way ahead on this, isn't it? And when I think, okay, well,
Yes, no, it is. It is.
we'll examine how far ahead it might be.
We are.
And
Well,
at least it's sensitive to the issues.
right.
And there are people in New York who are going to demand that there be green open spaces. But what about, and I just came back from New York and went to see a play. We went to see, of course, the High Line,
Okay.
which is
right.
like one of the it's the eighth wonder of the world or something. What do you
Well,
think of the High Line?
The High Line is a really beautiful landscape that's very well crafted. It was exciting to see so much public money go into a park, right? And it was also so exciting to see so many different agencies and factions within the city also get behind a piece of public infrastructure. And it was also, it's been a sort of phenomenal sort of tourist phenomena. It's a landmark, a new landscape landmark for the city. When you talk about coming to New York City, you might have said, where are you going to go? Oh, Central Park. Like Central Park is on everyone's list.
Yeah.
And now, like the High Line is on everyone's list, and Central Park is on everyone's list, right? And then there's of course the Met and MoMA and a lot of other important institutions. But it's really just a great thing.
It's got joy to it.
It does.
People who are there are all so happy. And a short little personal vignette. So we went there and we loved watching these people and all the stuff they were doing. It was a weekday. It wasn't even a weekend. And everybody's having such a wonderful time. Later on in the day, or it might have been the next day, we're uptown now. And some guy who had seen us at the High Line, my wife and me, he comes over and he says, "Wasn't that great?"
Really?
It was our common denominator, was our point of reference.
People
And we stood
connect.
there on the street corner having a conversation
Wow.
with this guy. We were both so impressed.
Were you wearing the Hawaiian shirt when you were on the
Yes,
High Line? So he
yes.
remembered you, right?
Well, what else in New York would you cite as a notable green space that improves the quality of the city?
Well, I live in Brooklyn, or in Brooklyn Heights, and quite recently, over the past 30 years, there was planning for building a new waterfront park along the Brooklyn waterfront, and Brooklyn Bridge Park was built. The landscape architect was Michael van Valkenburg, and he did a masterful job. It's really an incredible landscape. And I think one of the things that is exciting about it is that it also really helps it's a very sustainable park. It manages its own stormwater, and it used a lot of recycled materials, but ultimately it added all this incredible programming also to that water's edge. And it's just completely transformed the neighborhood and completely transformed the waterfront as a regional destination.
So it works.
It works, it totally works.
But what does that mean? In other words, I mean, at the end of the day, it's not only that I like it, but the community likes it. How do I know whether a given landscape, park, open space works?
Well, one of the things I thought was an indicator of success is I was in San Francisco with my 13-year-old son at a squash tournament, because my kids all play squash. So, and he said, "Mom, I want to go to the equivalent of Pier 6 in San Francisco." So he wanted to go to a place where there was a lot of soccer being played. And he said, "I love Pier 6 because people from all over the world come or go there to play soccer." And this 13-year-old kid who's really into soccer gets to go down there and play with people from all different places. And, you know, they're New Yorkers, some of them are visiting, whatever. They're just, but he gets exposed to all these different cultures. And I feel like that's one of the wonderful things about public parks, is that they bring people together around the common enjoyment of either the place, the atmosphere, nature, the landscape, or some kind of programming such as soccer. So it's an exciting
And it's a social
addition.
thing. It's a social
It's social,
thing.
exactly.
It's not one person. It's all the people who come and what happens between them in this special place.
Exactly, and it's not about this. Like, it's not, sorry, this is the fake
No.
iPhone here, right?
know,
It's not
we
about this,
know.
it's about like communicating with people,
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, yeah.
And that's what Park Space is all about. And people want to be with other people.
So how did you get into this? Was this something at the age of 8 you realized one day that you needed to do?
Well, I could say that, but it would be a lie. No, actually, when I was 8, I wanted to be a botanist. So close, right?
Close.
And
Close.
because my family on my mother's side were rose hybridizers, and they also invented the first curved roof greenhouses in the United States. The Pearson U-bar, which was the structural system for the Lord and Burnham greenhouses.
Was this in New York?
They were in New Jersey,
Okay.
which was the Garden State.
At one time it was anyway.
Once, right? But then, you know, as I got older, my father was a geophysicist, and so I thought, oh no, I want to be a geologist, right? So I went through a lot of different steps before and in college I studied art history, and thought I'd be a museum curator. So, you know, all of these
Great.
things ultimately kind of came together: art, science, drawing, making, horticulture. In the profession of landscape
Was
architecture.
there a defining moment or mentor that switched you on?
Well, you know, actually, it was an issue of progressive architecture that came to the architecture office I was working for, and it was all about landscape architecture. And I just had this epiphany. I thought, wow, that's really great. I mean, I didn't know the profession existed. I was 23 years old, and I had never even, you know, I didn't know about it. Yeah, I was introduced to the profession and thought this looks cool, and so I just picked up and moved to San Francisco because there were a lot of landscape architects there, and you can do that when you're 23. And yeah, so it was pretty great.
Yeah.
So what made you go back to Brooklyn or from San Francisco, which is kind of a cool place to
Well,
be?
I was in San Francisco and I applied to graduate school at Harvard, and I got in, which I didn't expect to get in, but I got in, and then I went and I spent 5 years there getting an architecture degree and a landscape architecture degree because I liked working at different scales, and I also liked working on something that was immediately beautiful and perfect, and then something that would get more perfect over time. Right, so
Wow, that's a pretty tall order.
Yeah.
well, I mean, perfect is a sort of
Perfect
a
is-
big
is-
statement,
is
but
an
you want to
okay.
strive for perfection,
Yeah.
right? Or you want to strive to make the best thing you can,
Yeah.
right? So I did both degrees, and then when I graduated, I moved to New York because I had met my now ex-husband. So, just to be honest.
Is he an
So-
architect
See the way
too,
life
or-
works.
He's not. He's a lawyer.
Oh,
so,
that's why. Explains it.
You sound like an artist, actually.
Oh,
You know, you're just painting with different brushes, that's all,
yeah, and painting with time.
with time.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what landscape
It's
architects do.
three-dimensional,
That's also
four-dimensional.
science.
It's the fourth
Yeah,
dimension.
you bring the
And-
science in.
Well,
which
and
is
that's one of the
really-
things that's exciting about some of the climate resilience work that we do, because what we're trying to think about is dynamic systems. We're thinking about how, you know, wave sort of fluctuations and storm surge might impact a city, and how sort of the rising sea level will ultimately impact a city, because it's not just, you know, a rising level of the sea kind of rising over time. It's also that you know, static moment becomes dynamic at times when you have a big storm, and then your impact upland is higher and greater. So
I remember Mayor Bloomberg, was it, decided that climate change was really a problem for New York, and he was going to build some kind of infrastructure to protect Manhattan anyway. Are you familiar with that? Were you involved with
well,
that?
in 2010, we were part of an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, so this was 2 years before Sandy, called Rising Currents. And me and my team, so DLANDstudio partnered with Architecture Research Office, and we did a proposal that is probably what you're thinking of, which showed these barrier islands around Lower Manhattan. That was my work.
Wow.
And what we proposed was not only that, but also transforming the upland infrastructure, so making the streets able to handle a lot of rain and stormwater. So if you had larger, more severe storms, which we're getting, this system would also handle that. So we did this project, and it's now in the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art and also the National Design Museum, the Cooper Hewitt.
Is it being built?
Well, parts of it actually are, because after Sandy, there was a recognition that action needed to happen. But I would say in the 2 years in between, a lot of things also happened, which were pushed forward by the Bloomberg administration. And I was part of a task force for rewriting some of the waterfront zoning and creating more resilient principles that could be applied by the public agencies. And that was really important because then, when Sandy hit, there was already a structure in place for action.
Right.
So
and people were, willing to do action.
People were
The
aware.
Mindset was good.
Exactly, and that happened also in part because of Plan YC, which was a brilliant document that Bloomberg put together for looking 30 years into the future about the city of New York. And it was this incredibly comprehensive document that had to do with the sustainability of the city. And it looked at economics, it looked at the environment, it looked at the amount of park space. I mean, it was broad. It was this incredible vision plan.
He was a visionary mayor.
He's a really visionary mayor. And, it was kind of a wonderful kind of driving force for my practice. Even if I wasn't working directly for him on anything, it was still, a great motivation.
Yeah, and to get into a museum over it. usually museums are afterward, not before. But
Right?
The plan got into a museum.
The plan got into a museum.
Well, let me shift gears because Sharon has to go a little while.
Okay.
And it would be unfair if we did not cover at least some of what you feel about Honolulu and the state, for that matter. You've looked around. We all came here and looked around and, and everybody I know looked around and said, "What is this? How come everything is totally eclectic and run down?" I don't know how you feel about it, but I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Well, I actually think it's really quite interesting, and a lot of
That's an interesting word.
Well,
interesting.
no, I
Interesting
mean-
in a Chinese sense. Yeah.
No. I think it's actually, there are a lot of really wonderful things. There are beautiful open spaces, incredible vistas. I've been walking everywhere. And
Good.
so, because I walk, I look at things, and I'm always looking for the problems. I can see places where there need to be adjustments. But one of the things I've been hearing from a lot of people, both people at the university and people from community groups and from development corporations and people at the city is, gosh, we would like to do something, but we somehow can't communicate. And political will is a problem. But one of the things I found really refreshing, and something that doesn't happen in New York, is that the mayor created these cabinet meetings where all of his agency heads actually have to come together and talk about what they're doing and their initiatives and see where there might be overlap. So that's a pretty
good
great thing.
And did you hear recently about his thing about parklets?
Oh yeah, I saw the presentation yesterday. It's
what
so
was
terrific.
that about? Talk
Well,
about it.
basically you take over a parking space and you put in some kind of temporary public function. So I think it's actually part of the Complete Streets program as well. But the thing that's nice about it is that you could have a variety of different programs within the parklets. We actually did some for Morristown, New Jersey. The fact that the DOT is sponsoring this is a really kind of visionary thing, because these parklets are starting to pop up in different places around the country. There's some in LA, there's some in San Francisco, and a place like Miami is perfect because you have this wonderful weather, and you can start to take back the public realm from cars.
Yeah,
which is really nice.
It's very important. But before you got to split, before we take a break here, Sharon, do you have any questions that you want to ask Susannah about Honolulu and about the future of Honolulu?
Well, I think what's really what we would like to see more of is, open green space. And when Susannah walked around and she saw how beautiful the landscape was, and then she saw all these buildings coming up, and how can we actually create a plan or ways in which we can use more of the green and expand that in ways that we can make it functional and keep paradise a little bit more paradise than we have.
Well, I think there needs to be a recognition of view corridors, and it's funny because in New York City, we only have one protected view corridor, and it's actually from the Brooklyn Heights Promenade to Lower Manhattan. But in other places, buildings can go up really high, right? But we have a grid. So there's always kind of a guarantee of a space, between the grids, right? So when you get on that east-west axis, you're always guaranteed you're going to be able to see through. But we don't have, if I look through Manhattan, I'm looking at New Jersey, and I might be able to see the Palisades, but I don't have the same kind of topography you have here. And I think the recognition that the mountains are so extraordinarily beautiful is really important, and that the view from the waterfront to the mountains should be as valuable as the view from the high-rise tower to the ocean.
Yeah.
Right, I think there needs to be a reciprocity in terms of the understanding the value of both views. So.
And you said in Brooklyn you fought for having that kind of view and value for the landscape, and I'm just kind of thinking, how might that happen here with so many people valuing the landscape but not doing enough to protect it? So what might be some lessons learned?
The way that I was able to get involved with protecting that view was by helping to testify for a community group that was really fighting to protect the view. So it wasn't me as the individual saying, hey, this needs to be protected. It was a community group came to me and said, we really need your help. You're an expert on urban design. You're an expert on landscape architecture. You're also one of the more altruistic landscape architects and architects out there. Will you help us? And so I testified and I said I thought it was wrong for a developer to build a 45-foot bulkhead on top of a 100-foot building as a mechanical space that didn't count. That's just wrong. It's morally wrong, particularly in a place where you have a protected view corridor and you have one of the most valuable views in the world, the view of the Brooklyn Bridge. I mean, it's such a no-brainer, and it was so wrong that people at the Development Corporation and the architecture firm tried to cheat. So now the senator has come out against it, and our city council person's come out against it, and there's a lawsuit, and it sounds like it might come down. It might come down, and the developer might make a little bit less money. But they might make just as much money because the real estate now is so valuable.
Yeah.
Brooklyn Bridge Park has made this real estate so valuable that I'm not that concerned that their bottom line is going to actually be hurt. I think they can just charge more.
Yeah.
I mean,
good that you testified. Right. But I get two things out of that. One is good.
I'm stupid from a business perspective.
Good planning requires partnerships.
It does.
It requires the group that came to you and requires you to reinforce the group.
But there was also an agreement between the community and the Development Corporation that was broken. So the public trust was broken, and that was a problem.
And that's a continuum too. Seems like at first we're talking about just following the code, but then we're talking about aesthetics, which rises higher, and then we're talking about the public trust, and finally you mentioned a question of morality, and it does rise to that in our time. And after this break, I want to talk to you some more about that, about public spaces and what they mean to the future of our country and maybe the world.
Great.
Okay.
Sharon, we're going to take
Big
a
topics.
break. Okay, and we're going to let you go to your meeting.
Okay, thank you.
For setting
Thank
this
you
up
so
and
much.
being here.
Thank you. I'll see
It's
you later.
wonderful to have this discussion.
Okay.
We'll be right back after this short break.
Aloha, my name is Reg Baker, and I'm the host of Business in Hawaii with Reg Baker. Business in Hawaii is a program that is positive stories about business in Hawaii. We're tired of hearing the negativity and why it's the wrong place to have a business. We talk about the positive reasons for having a business in Hawaii and how to be successful. We broadcast live every Thursday at 2 o'clock. We look forward to seeing you. Aloha.
Aloha, namaskar, and hello. My name is Anu Hittel, and I host the show called Climate Change Beyond Outrage. We go beyond outrage to find solutions to climate problems facing people, nations, and the world. I hope you will join me here every Tuesday at 1 o'clock. We broadcast live from thinktechhawaii.com. Aloha and bye-bye.
Okay, we're back. We're live. We're having a wonderful time this afternoon on Wednesday with Susannah Drake of DLANDstudio in Brooklyn, designing New York and far beyond. Here on Community Matters, talking about today's public architecture and landscaping, which is so important everywhere. It's a quality of life. It's a quality of spiritual life that you need to have around you. This wasn't something we were thinking about in the 40s or the 50s or even the 60s, were we?
Well, actually, we were.
Okay.
I would say there's a legacy of the creation of open space coming out of the Works Progress Administration, right?
That's back to Roosevelt.
We're back to Roosevelt. So I'm skipping back, a couple decades.
I remember it well.
Right, but I think in the 40s and 50s, we were really, we were at war. We had a different focus. And then I think in the post-war period, we were really focused on sort of rebuilding the country. And I think that one of the things I talk about in my lecture is the building of the National Highway System. And it was called the National Highway Defense System, right? And Eisenhower cast it as a defense system, I think because it was a good way to pitch it to a wounded nation, right? But it also was a really phenomenal development scheme because it opened up huge parts of the country that weren't really accessible at the time. But the problem is that those highways went to cities. It was originally planned to go to cities, but not into cities, right? And it was extended an additional decade to get it into cities, but what it did was kind of destroy our cities. So it really took away the notion of public space because the car became the prime sort of driver of the creation of new modes of urban design.
My wife and I were in France driving, and we left Rouen to go to Paris. And it was something 70 or 80 kilometers, not that far. We got maybe 40 of the kilometers, and then all of a sudden, down in a tunnel. Now we were in a tunnel. And we drove for a long time in this one long tunnel. And then finally we came up and we were in the middle of Paris.
Oh, nice.
I thought that was a beautiful idea.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I like that.
You could do that elsewhere.
You could do that in a lot of places.
Yeah.
It's really just an issue of vision.
Yeah,
Right?
vision. And I think
I'm not quite sure how to help you with that.
I wasn't asking you.
you said something like, Alexa. Oh. So there are many places in Europe that I remember was just fabulous. There's one town in the south where there's no parking. There's no parking. There's no cars. Nothing. It's all a walking city, and it's just beautiful. And outside you can have parking, and you can have a circumference road. I mean, we kind of have missed out on that, haven't we, in this country? And one of the problems is, talk about the buildings that Sharon's concerned with in Kaka'ako.
Right.
They're going to be there a long time. The useful life of one of those buildings, it's not until you pay the mortgage. It's way longer than that, hundreds of years before it becomes an economic requirement to knock it down. And that's so all over the country and maybe the world. How are we going to fix that kind of infrastructure problem?
Well, I guess, I don't know, I'm not quite sure how to answer that because it's such a broad question. I think as our cities age, we need to think about kind of an adaptive reuse and a rethinking of the sort of car culture. But that's kind of a tough one to move. It's hard to move the needle on that. I think when you were talking about Kaka'ako, you may have been referring to the fact that when it was planned, there was basically a deck on the bottom and then towers above.
Yes.
Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
Because that was actually part of the 1964 master plan for New York City, and happily, a lot of it was not built. And most of it has been adapted. So it's really not impossible to change the structure of these buildings even after they're built. Because particularly if you're designing for a parking load on the bottom, you know, you can adapt those spaces. They're built for a pretty heavy load.
To go to Michael Kimmelman, who, I mean, I just stumbled into him, you know. I told you we were doing a program last year in public spaces, and I must have Googled it or something, and there he was. And I couldn't take my eyes off him. And he went on for a long time. He was at Yale teaching, giving a lecture to the students, I guess. And it was really captivating. And it taught me that, you know, public spaces in Europe and in the U.S. are critically important for the, what do you call it, the mental
zeitgeist.
health. Oh. The zeitgeist, yeah. And that's got to be part of where you are. It's more than architecture. It's more than landscape architecture. It's creating an environment in which people are just a little happier.
Yeah, I think Michael is a wonderful architecture critic because he really cares about public space and public architecture, perhaps more than some of the other critics who have historically written for the New York Times. And I think that probably comes from the fact that he grew up in the West Village. Right? So, and this is the West Village of New York City, which is where Jane Jacobs kind of made her mark in protecting the community from Robert Moses, frankly, from having him put another highway through the middle of the community. So you have to think, okay, here's a guy who grew up in that context. He grew up in a walking place of low-rise brownstones, and you know, that has to affect the way you perceive the world.
Yes.
Right? And he grew up in a family of intellectuals as well, and he's also a concert pianist. So he enjoys culture and arts, and he was the art critic for the New York Times before he became the architecture critic, right?
Yes.
So, you know, you have someone who really appreciates sort of nuance and culture and sort of the sort of intellectual components of what we're doing, but I think also really cares deeply about communities and is able to express that in his writing, which is wonderful because I think it brings a lot of public awareness to the importance of open space.
Is it fair to say that public awareness about public spaces is increasing in our time? Is the group that you and Michael Kimmelman are, you know, creating, is that growing?
I think it is increasing, and I think that there's an increasing awareness also of climate change in urban settings. When you have a disaster like Katrina, or you have a disaster like Irene, which hit my home state of Vermont really hard, or you have a disaster like Sandy, in a short period of time, that all happened within a few years. I think that there is a recognition that we need to be changing the shape of our cities, and that public spaces may actually be a tool, part of our toolkit for how we can protect cities. And so I find that really exciting.
Yeah, but even if there were no climate change, we'd still need to do it.
It's true, we still are human.
Yeah,
right?
Well, our cities have become, in some part, not very friendly to humans. And I agree with you, there are elements. You talk about, I'm thinking of Gay Street, in Manhattan and in West Village. And all those in the 50s and the 60s on the east side, those are beautiful walking streets. There are trees there, it's so walkable and interesting to be there. And everything seems to be well organized. Maybe one of the finest areas, residential areas in the world, really. The problem is there are other areas in the city that really need work. And I guess what I hear you saying is you're an altruistic architect. And you're an architect, that wants to improve it for everyone. So your target must be the neighborhoods that need the work.
Well, yes. And I'm working in some of the less well-served places, like in Lusaurus, which is Southside Williamsburg. So there's like rich hipster Williamsburg, and then there's poor Latino Williamsburg. And what I'm trying to do is actually bring a new public park space to that community by capping the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. So starting to kind of heal the wounds of Robert Moses's vision by putting basically a deck over the highway.
Oh, no kidding.
Right?
That's a lot of construction, though, isn't it?
Well, it's not so bad, actually. If you design it right and you plan it right and you build most of the things off-site and then you just assemble, you can actually do it pretty quickly. It's
So
only
you cover the whole
right.
thing, like Park Avenue, you cover the whole thing, you make a tunnel out of it?
It's kind of like Park Avenue, but it's only for 2 blocks. And I think this is a strategy that should be considered in a lot of places. There are a couple places where it could happen here, like up by the Botanical Garden, where, you know, if you just basically fill in between 2 highway bridges that might need to be replaced anyway because they're at the end of their lifespan, you know, then you could have a new kind of access way for a community. You know, maybe you have a residential community on one side and the Botanical Garden on the other side, for instance. You know, you could have a new kind of open space in between. And for the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, it's really an issue of, you know, we have a territorial boundary as well for gangs. And so if we put in,
That's pretty realistic, yeah.
right? Well, yeah, so if we put in this park space in between and build sports fields, you know, maybe the kids are going to get involved in sports instead of getting involved in gangs,
Yeah.
right?
You're
So-
effectively gentrifying everything around it. I mean, when I say maybe a loose use of the term, but I mean, you're making better neighborhoods around it.
We're trying to.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, we're also working with the Trust for Public Land on a project called Queensway, which is a trail. And it's a trail that goes through Queens, and it goes from quite affluent Queens to quite poor Queens.
A trail in New York?
It's a trail. It's a former rail corridor that has been left fallow for 60 years.
Nothing on it.
So nothing except, you know, homeless
Rail.
people and,
Oh, my goodness.
you know, sort of encampments, and
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think
yeah.
people go there to do bad things.
Yeah.
So it's a landscape that could be really beautiful. And so the Trust for Public Land is working with the Friends of Queensway. So TPL is a national organization that has an office here, actually. And then they're working with this local organization called the Friends of the Queensway to basically mobilize public support for a new trail that will add 47 acres of new open space to New York City. So that's pretty good,
That's great.
right?
That's great.
Like gold, right?
So are there other people like D-Land? I mean, are you unique?
There are some really good landscape architects out there.
I mean, public space architects, really.
There are some. I don't think there's anybody that does the sort of weird or operates the strange way that we do, because what I do is I sort of go around the city and look for problems, like, oh, wow, there's a stormwater problem here because you have a downspout coming off a highway. Let's design something to absorb that water, and then it could be replicated 5 million times and actually make a huge difference. So I look for broken systems, and then I come up with ways of fixing it. And the thing that's strange about the way that I work is that I work with community groups to apply for grants to do pilots. And that's a novel process. That hasn't really happened before, because we do the pilots and then we go and say, oh, public agency, you know, will you let us do a pilot on your property because, oh, by the way, we happen to be in an area that is really underserved for open space, and we have high asthma rates, and you really haven't been putting your resources into our community.
Pretty persuasive stuff.
So yeah, exactly. And, you know, I feel like I'm helping these
But you're being
different community
proactive.
groups.
You're an architect who's being proactive. And I
Yes.
think a lot of architects, they wait for the owner to come, they wait for him to write a check, and they take his specifications pretty religiously, and they do it. And I think you're part of a new generation of architects that are actually proactive. They go out there and
Right.
they take the first step themselves.
Well, I think part of that is because I wanted to do public work, and I'm a small women-owned business, and the public agencies were not going to give the work to a small woman-owned business who, you know, I started my firm when I was 40. I had a lot of experience when I started my office, but you know, I couldn't get a public project. I had one public agency say to me, oh, you know, you had the best interview, you had the best ideas, you know, clearly, you should have gotten the project, but we haven't worked with you before, so we didn't hire you. And I thought, isn't that illegal?
It's against the
But-
law, yeah.
Yeah, it's against the law, but they didn't write it in an email, unfortunately.
They knew.
So, but that's when it was sort of a turning point. I thought, well, I could waste a lot of money applying for RFPs for projects that they're going to give to the big, the big guys, the big engineers, or I could take on this more subversive kind of methodology where I actually get to work with the community groups. I get to do the projects I like, and make it happen.
Can you earn a living doing it that way?
Yeah, actually you can. Well, you can survive, like we have a mix of things. Now the public agencies have started to hire me, so that's helpful. So
They heard about you already.
well, and now they recognize that we actually are performing, that we're bringing things in on time and on budget, and really making them look good.
So there must be others who would like to do the same thing. I mean, you said altruistic. Surely there must be other altruistic architects in the city.
Oh, there are plenty of altruistic architects. There's just nobody that does it this way,
Okay,
right? So
okay.
no, there are lots of people doing like very good public work. We work with an organization, there's an architecture firm called Leroy Street Studio, and they have an arm called the Hester Street Collaborative, and Hester Street works with communities to actually do pop-up projects and raise awareness about the importance of design within the communities and how design can actually improve the environment of some underserved neighborhoods.
So is it keeping up, because the city's getting older, neighborhoods are, declining, buildings are getting older and declining. You have a lot of work on your hands to actually, make progress, to keep ahead of the curve. Are you keeping ahead? Are you, that is the city and people like you, keeping ahead of the curve?
Well, what do you mean by keeping ahead of the curve? Are we
renewing it faster than it gets old?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't really like to think about that. That's sort of like, I'm running a marathon and, there might be people ahead of me. But I just think about, one problem at a time.
One project.
Whatever I'm doing. I mean, I try to think about the potential for the replicability of the systems that I'm creating and the potential impact. And I would like to think that will be ahead of the curve. And actually, one of the ways we are working on that issue or considering that issue is that we're doing monitoring of our stormwater projects. So we do a lot of work on stormwater management. And what we're doing is we're monitoring the amount of water coming in and the amount of water coming out and the water quality. So once we have that data, we'll be able to look at the impact of replicating the system on a citywide basis. So then I'll be able to answer that question. I'll be able to say, yes, right?
Yes.
Yes, because my sponge park, which absorbs 2 million gallons of stormwater every year, is actually absorbing, we predict it will, right?
Yeah.
And we've calculated that it will, but we need to prove it,
Yeah.
right?
And once you do,
Once we do,
it's an unavoidable suggestion.
exactly, and then we map every street end in New York City, and even if there's 100 of them, it's worth it to do them everywhere.
What are the challenges for you? Because your challenges there, I'm sure we have similar challenges here. When you go to a government agency, are they just happy peachy to see you? Are there issues around funding, approvals? What are your challenges?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
No, I think interagency coordination, so that has gotten better, and I have to thank Bloomberg for that, but the coordination between the Department of Transportation, Department of Environmental Protection, and Department of Parks, that's kind of the main one that I have to deal with. And now I think there's an understanding that we're all like working toward the same kind of goal. Like they know me well enough now that it's kind of okay.
Yeah.
But there are other layers. There are the state layers, and the state is actually very supportive of what we do. And oftentimes I find that the state is actually pushing for us to do something that the city is not quite ready to do.
Interesting.
And even at the federal level, we're working in an EPA Superfund site, and we had very early approval for the work we were doing, but there's also the issue of agencies changing their mind in the middle. So one of the great things that happened with the Sponge Park is we spent 8 years planning and getting all the approvals, and it was about 8 weeks of construction because I designed everything so it could go in really fast. And that was in part because it's a Superfund site, it's a brownfield site, we have a tidal atmosphere, so we needed to, or a tidal, it's tidal ground, so we needed to be able to logistically put it in quickly. But we put it in so quickly that the EPA came out to look at it and they said, wait, you're going too fast.
Gone too fast.
And we said, no, it's done. We gave you the drawings, you had the approval or time to approve, and here we go.
What about
and we
EIS?
Did.
You have issues with EIS. I mean, how does it work in New York? I mean, theoretically, it's all federal, but do they get in your way, the need to do an EIS? Do you have to do it all the time? How many of your projects are stalled by EIS requirements?
We didn't have to do an EIS for really any, or haven't had to do an EIS for any of our projects, and most of the work that we're doing has either already had them or has been the benefit of not really being at a scale where it's necessary. So that hasn't been a problem.
Good.
I think the EISs are very important, but I also as a community member, I was concerned that the EIS that was done for Brooklyn Bridge Park didn't necessarily reflect the reality of what happened. And we all knew it, but we all wanted the park to happen. So we just
Balancing, it's a balancing of
right,
equities.
put the blinders on.
Well, it strikes me that as you do your thing and have these projects and they blossom and bloom and make people happier, that the more people will like them and want them, and they'll find, they'll be sympathetic, but they'll also find places that need this kind of treatment. And the question is, you must be very busy, and not only are you very busy now, but it seems to me that once the city awakens, and public awareness rises over this, you're going to be so busy. How big are you, and how big are you going to get, you think?
Well, I'm a fairly small firm. I have 10 people, but I'm bringing on 2 partners so that we can assure just very high level of quality and project delivery, and also manage the sort of human resources of the firm to make them as efficient as possible. So but I don't think we want to get really huge because I don't think we need to be really huge, but I do think that we
might
will
lose
probably
something in the process.
Yeah, I think so. But in bringing on these partners, what I think will happen is it will enable me to continue to innovate. And I also teach at various schools. I've been an adjunct professor at now I'm an adjunct at IIT, so it's much nicer to be here.
Clearly you have too much time
than in
on your
Chicago.
hands, Susan.
Yeah, well, I like to work. I came to Hawaii, and what do? I've been working the entire time, but it's been so great because I've met so many interesting people.
Well, that takes me to the question of whether you ever work outside of the city, New York City,
Right.
whether you do projects in other cities, other states, other countries, whether you would ever consider doing a project here.
Well, yes, I do projects all over the world. Last year I did this vertical farm for the Milan Expo, creating this wall of food that was the size of a
that
football
sounds great.
field. It was
Yeah.
great. It produced about 6,000 pounds of
Really?
food a week. It was amazing. So I did that last year, and I designed the Public Media Commons in St. Louis. And we're currently working on the redesign of 25 blocks of New Orleans.
Downtown area?
No, it's actually the St. Roch neighborhood, so it's more of an underserved neighborhood. And it's an area with very high water table. It's really complicated and very low budget because we're trying to deal with municipal resources. And we also have some money coming in from the federal government, but we're not sure how much of that is actually going to make it to our project versus the city as a whole. So we're working in a lot of different contexts, and I like that and want to do that because New York has been a wonderful test kitchen, but I think some of the ideas that we've been sort of simmering or testing there can be applied on a broader level.
Yeah.
I would love to do work in Hawaii. One of my new business partners is actually Hawaiian.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's a great connection.
It is a good connection,
Yeah.
and she's wonderful, and she's so chill. She went to Berkeley for grad school. She's just like, she's got a good vibe.
I really hope you do that. That would be wonderful because
so.
we need what you're doing here.
Well, thank
We
you.
have to get our heads around how we're going to make a city that everybody will like.
Well, people have been very receptive, from, community members, clearly, to Sharon, and also people in city government. They're really interested in what we were talking about. So it's really, it's nice to be so well received.
Are your projects getting bigger over time? Because it strikes me that, sometimes you have a whole neighborhood that's messed up, and you want to just demolish it. Sort of the way they did city planning in New Haven in the 50s and 60s, and they redid the downtown. Didn't work very well, but they tried anyway. Mayor Lee, as I recall, did that. But sometimes we have infrastructure that has failed. We have neighborhoods that have failed, and you can't do much with it on a patchwork basis. You have to really move in there and replan the thing. No?
Well, for the Rising Currents exhibition, what we wanted to do with Lower Manhattan, and I'm not saying Lower Manhattan is broken, but I'm saying what we wanted to do was actually gut the streets and make the street bed permeable, and then put all the infrastructure into waterproof vaults underneath the sidewalk.
Yeah.
And the thought was that, if the infrastructure broke or ever became obsolete, you'd open up a vault, have it accessible,
That's
and you'd
sustainable.
replace it, right?
Yeah.
But what that would do is actually open up the street bed to make it permeable. And 27% of New York City is paved with roads.
Yeah.
So we thought you could solve the CSO issue. You could absorb all the surface water runoff.
Yeah.
So there may be times when we think we can't change things, but it may be that we're just looking at the things we can see and not thinking about what's underneath the ground. And so that's one of the things I want to work on, right?
How did you think of that? That's really out of the box completely.
I don't know, my father's geophysicist.
I guess.
I've been looking at sections for my entire life, I remember the way he described plate tectonics. He was like, it's like this, or it's like, he would describe different kind of, geologic moments with his hands, like, oh, there's this one, and there's this one, and, so.
At the end of the day, it's geophysics.
It's geophysics, and it's gardening, it's like thinking about the permeability of the ground. It's thinking about how to make a healthy landscape, or the value of soil, those things. So.
Wonderful to talk to you. I want to offer you a minute or two to look at that camera number 2.
Okay.
You're not going to be here forever. You're going to take off. Your trip is over in a day or two.
Right.
But what would you leave with the people of Hawaii about this whole issue of public spaces, architecture, and landscape architecture?
Well, unfortunately, I have to leave tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. To fly to Los Angeles. But on my way back, making sort of a West Coast tour, or a Western tour. I shouldn't say West Coast because we're kind of off coast here. But I think one of the things to think about is that the environment here is dynamic, and it used to be, historically going back 800 years, a very sustainable system. And it would be good to sort of remember some of those principles, the principles that sort of created the culture here in its redevelopment, and not like go back to what was there, but sort of recognize what was important in relation to the sustainability of living on this landscape, living on this island, right? So if those kinds of initial principles can be built into the new work that we do, in maybe thinking about a shoreline that may be changing, or stormwater that's coming off of the landscape, or where our food is coming from in the community, or how we're actually occupying some of the streets and using the open spaces, how we're getting around. If we can start to think very holistically about the nature of this landscape, I think then we may make some breakthroughs in creating a more sustainable and beautiful Honolulu.
I think I love you. Susannah Drake, DLANDstudio in Brooklyn, New York, here on Community Matters. What a treat, what an honor, talking about public architecture and landscaping. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Nice.